Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Thought Leader Roundtable, a conversation on readiness. Today's session is part of a regular series of explorations of the key questions of what does it really mean for all young people to be ready for life's demands at every stage, and what is it going to take to get there? Karen Pittman, CEO of the Forum for Youth Investment, leads lively and candid conversations with some of the most influential, boundary-pushing leaders working to improve the lives of children and young people in the United States. Today's session features Cheri Hoffman, the chair of the Federal Interagency Working Group on Youth Programs. And the session will explore how the working group helps federal agencies approach positive youth development and emerging ways that the working group is tackling its mission. A little bit about our presenters today. Karen Pittman is President and CEO of the Forum for Youth Investment and a respected sociologist and leader in youth development. Prior to co-founding the Forum in 1998, she launched adolescent pregnancy prevention initiatives at the Children's Defense Fund, started the Center for Youth Development and Policy Research, and served as Senior Vice President at the International Youth Foundation. Cheri Hoffman is the Director of the Children and Youth Policy Division in the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. The CYP division develops and reviews policy initiatives focused on the well-being of children and youth, including those in early childhood learning settings, the child welfare system, and youth programs across federal agencies. Cheri serves as the chair for the Interagency Working Group on Youth Programs, established by President George W. Bush Executive Order in 2008. The 21 member agencies and offices of the working group span the federal government, representing a broad cross-section of youth programming. A little bit about logistics for today. There are only a few slides for today's session. We will be accepting questions and comments via the chat feature, which is available at the bottom of your screen. We also have some colleagues who will be live tweeting, so if you're on Twitter, please follow the hashtag ReadyYouth. Today's session is being recorded. Later this week, it will be sent to everyone who registered and also posted to the Forum website, along with any additional resources that are mentioned on the call. So it's now my pleasure to turn it over to Karen.
Thank you, Ian, and welcome, Cheri. I'm so glad we were able to make this happen. It was going to be a virtual meeting no matter what, but very glad that we're able to go forward with this. It really does seem that now more than ever, coordination is the name of the game as we're really figuring out how as a country to respond to the coronavirus. And I'm sure that there are specific things that you'll have to tell us in a bit about resources that the federal government has. But I think it's really important today that we sort of stay on track and stay with the idea of, even when we aren't in moments of crisis, why interagency coordination is so important. And start with a little bit of having you give us the history of the Interagency Working Group on Youth Programs, how it got started and where it is now.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Karen. It's an honor for me to be here. I appreciate the invitation, and I'm excited about the chance to talk about how we're coordinating across the federal government and serving youth, and not only across the federal government, but also with amazing organizations like the Forum for Youth Investment and others that all have the same goals in mind to improve outcomes for our young people. So as Ian mentioned at the beginning, the Interagency Working Group on Youth Programs started in 2008 under an executive order from President George W. Bush. And it grew out of work that First Lady Laura Bush was doing. They called it Helping America's Youth. And they had done a number of listening sessions across the country, really hearing from young people and adults who worked with young people and love young people. Really hearing from them across the country about the different issues that they were facing and what was most needed. And they ended up deciding right sort of at the end of George W. Bush's presidency to kind of institutionalize the work that had been happening through this interagency working group. And so really the goals of the working group that they laid out for us, the primary goal is to improve outcomes for youth, which is a very broad goal. And to do that primarily by collaborating and coordinating among federal youth serving agencies. And we were also charged in that executive order to deliver information about evidence-based programming that improves outcomes for youth, and to create a federal interagency website on youth, which we define as ages 10 to 24, following some of the best brain science that's out there now about how long brain development actually takes. And so we put together what's now called youth.gov, and that is available for anyone. We really focus that on adults who work with youth, and there's also a small or another web page that's part of youth.gov that is called Youth Engaged for Change, which is directed directly to young people and also has some associated social media channels with it. Right, this is the homepage of youth.gov right now. And as Karen mentioned, we of course are doing our best to get information out about coronavirus as much as we can. And if you go to youth.gov and click into that article that's showing on the screen right now, you would get to a few federal websites, the CDC, and some from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, about how to help young people through the current crisis that we're having. And we're also working with the CDC and a group of young people who serve as our editorial board for the Youth Engaged for Change website to translate some of these resources into language that young people are more used to seeing and would better understand. There haven't been many resources put out that focus on this youth population and making sure that we're getting information to them, right? Social relationships and relationship with peers and family are so crucial for adolescent development, and we want to make sure that they, even in a time of social distancing or physical distancing, young people are understanding what needs to happen and how they can do that in ways that continue their normal adolescent development at the same time. So that's a good look at youth.gov right there. And I think it was maybe a previous slide that had a list of all of the agencies that are part of the working group. The number sort of changes depending on where you look. We say 21 right now, but it depends on who is officially at the table and coming to our meetings. We've been meeting monthly, essentially over the last 12 years since that executive order came into being, with folks from all of these agencies and some that even aren't represented here that come and go when they have work that's directed at our target age range. But the Department of Health and Human Services was named in the executive order as the chair. The Department of Justice and OJJDP, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, has really taken up the role of vice chair. And we work with them to have content specific to children of incarcerated parents on youth.gov. And then all of these other agencies have the opportunity to meet with us monthly, listen to what's happening across the government, produce content that they can then use youth.gov to disseminate. And we really try to make youth.gov a one-stop shop for all the federal information that has to do with programming and resources for young people. So I hope that you can take a little bit of time and look around youth.gov. We have multiple youth topics there, sort of any issue that might be affecting young people at any given time, whether that's about behavioral health, substance abuse and mental health, or about juvenile justice programs, or financial literacy skills, or lots of different information on there, different ways for the arts to be involved in young people's lives, workforce and education programs, that sort of thing. So please take a look and let us know if there's anything on there that could be more helpful. If you go down to the bottom left corner of the youth.gov page, you will see right there, it's at the top left on your screen now, where you can subscribe to an e-newsletter. And if you put your email there about once a month, we send out a newsletter that has a feature article on some new content that might be on youth.gov, often sort of lined up with different celebrations or different focuses of the month, right? If April is Prevent Child Abuse Month, so there might be some content about that, or Financial Literacy Month, that sort of thing. And we direct you to any new resources and information there. There's also some information about federal funding opportunities that comes with that newsletter. There's a funding center on youth.gov that has a lot of information about how to apply for federal grants, which can be a very tricky and confusing process. So we've tried to be helpful with the information we've provided there. So a number of features there available on youth.gov that we hope you will take advantage of.
Wonderful. And I really do encourage people to look at the site. There's a treasure trove of information there, and I go to it frequently. One of the things that I actually go to the site most frequently for, and you'd think I would have this memorized by now, is the definition that you all have given to youth development.
Yeah.
And I think that it's incredibly important that the federal government has an official definition of positive youth development, and would love for you to, it's not the shortest definition, but I'd love for you to sort of unpack this a bit for us and tell us how the process that you all went through as so many different departments and agencies with so many different sort of hands on different parts of the elephant. How did you end up with this definition?
Yeah, that's a great metaphor for how this goes with hands on different parts of the elephant. This was a really collaborative process. I will say that it predates me arriving at HHS, so I was not part of putting this together. But you know, we have some of the greatest minds, the greatest positive youth development minds, are folks who have been in government service for a long time. You know, I did not know before I started in this position and being the chair of this group that 4-H is a federal program. I did not realize that that grew out of USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And we have had folks that have been part of our staff level working group for a long time who've been working in this field for many, many years and really understand positive youth development from its very, very roots. And so folks like that were part of drafting a definition, and then we did a lot of sharing that among our members, working through it, kind of getting all the parts and pieces into it. And it's, you know, it's very difficult to make one definition that reaches everyone who's doing this kind of work, but we really think we've hit the key points here where we're talking about an intentional and pro-social approach that is allowing youth to connect with all of these different groups of people who talk or who have great impact on young people's lives, their peers, their schools, their organizations, their communities. And we really are thinking about this from a strengths-based perspective, right? We're talking about the assets that young people have and all of the incredible gifts and the strengths that they bring to addressing issues in their communities and in their schools. And we're thinking about promoting those positive outcomes. It's so easy to slip into the mindset of fixing problems, particularly when you're talking about from a government perspective, because the government really is set up to be that safety net or that structure that steps in when something is wrong. So it's a real shift to try to have people be thinking about the positive outcomes that we want to see for young people and to be thinking about the strengths that young people bring to the table. So that's really where positive youth development fits in so nicely with what we want to do. I really like to talk about the role of the working group. I see this interagency working group on youth programs as a way to infiltrate the federal government with a positive youth development approach. Many agencies are already thinking that way and doing a lot of things that is PYD, as we call positive youth development. And some agencies have really not ever thought about it before. So we'll talk a little bit more later on about the specific agencies and such that are involved, but we were able to kind of get everyone to the table and get clearance on using this definition. And it's such good news that folks outside the government have found it really useful. There are a number of agencies that use this definition in funding announcements. If they are, you know, putting out a call for applications for grants that they want to take a positive youth development approach, they look to this definition so that everybody's kind of using the same language and thinking in the same way when they talk about positive youth development. It's, you know, folks really do look to the federal government to set some standards, and this is one way that we wanted to do that for positive youth development.
It really is incredibly valuable to have it. I think, I quote, obviously work with 4-H closely and glad to see that you're in the House, Rebecca. It's so critically important to have a definition and have it validated by the agencies. This definition plus just going back frequently to the National Research Council 2002 report, consensus document on community programs that promote youth development,
Right.
has been really important to have those. You can't get more official than, you know, the National Academy of Sciences, National Research Council, and an interagency work group representing all of the federal agencies when you want to help people understand that this kind of pro-social asset forward approach to youth development makes sense. And I love the fact that you used the word infiltrating. We are still infiltrating at all levels, so you're not alone.
Right.
At the federal level. Any other, I mean, because you've got such a range, as you said, of agencies that have been at the forefront of creating these kind of definitions, and agencies that are still, you know, by mandate, sort of working in more of a deficit space. And any other examples that feel useful of where you've seen this infiltration sort of get traction?
Yeah, I think the Children's Bureau, so the folks at Health and Human Services that do all the child welfare programs and support for young people who are in the foster care system, they are a really great example of a federal agency that has taken a positive youth development approach for many years now. And they work very hard to have young people with lived experience of foster care be involved in the decision making. And that's difficult to do, right? That's difficult to do in kind of any organization. It's a shift in the way that people think about leading organizations. It's a shift in thinking about young people strictly as recipients of services and starting to think about them as decision makers and having those strengths that we talked about and those assets to bring to determine what the services should be, or to, you know, work in partnership with adults to be doing all of the things that an agency does. And the Children's Bureau has a set of young adult consultants who are young people with lived experience in the foster care system who work just like any other staff member at the Children's Bureau might work. They're involved in everything from sending out grant announcements to reviewing the grant applications when they come in and helping to make the decisions about what gets funded. They work in training and technical assistance capacities and reaching out when people have questions and providing answers from the viewpoint of a young person who has experienced the system. And they're a really great, strong example of a federal agency that's been doing this for a while, and they continue to lead and to help us understand the ways that this kind of approach can be operationalized within a federal agency. And then we have both FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and NASA, our space folks. They both have really great youth councils that operate, and they operate in different ways. You know, sometimes it's about coming on board for a year and taking on a particular project that is of interest to the young person and something that NASA or FEMA wants to pursue. And that young person works in partnership with a federal staff person to create something tangible, some sort of outcome, some sort of product that the agency then uses in the course of their work. And both of those are really great examples of young people being partnered with adults and learning how to make the kinds of decisions that are expected of a staff person at a federal agency. And there's lots of folks across the government. I would point folks to onuth.gov. There is a positive youth development youth topic, and there's some new content in there. This new content is also in the slideshow that we looked at earlier too. You can find it there as well. But there's a report on there, about a 50-page report of a number of agencies and how they are utilizing young people in either delivering services or providing content, creating content for young people coming from those federal agencies. So, you know, the agencies really run the gamut kind of along the spectrum of youth engagement or of positive youth development. Those that I've mentioned that have been doing this for a long time and do it really well, and those that are kind of just learning that this sort of cultural shift or perspective shift to engaging young people in the delivery of services and the planning of services is possible. So our goal within the working group is really to move folks kind of one step along the ladder. So wherever they are, we want to help them move one step forward. And we do a lot of that by highlighting those programs that have active youth engagement efforts happening. That's something that you can find that report on youth.gov if you're interested in seeing what other federal agencies are doing.
Yeah, that's terrific. And I think in addition to the important work, and it's critically important around youth engagement and really getting young people in as advisors and consultants, there's also just a huge amount of work, again, uneven, but moving forward. And I think for me, this is one of the accomplishments that I would if it doesn't get direct credit to the Interagency Working Group, it's a sign that the agencies, because they're sort of in this water together moving forward. Two examples that I've been familiar with and worked on are, the Administration for Children, Youth, and Families really taking a deliberate approach to go from thinking just about child safety to thinking about child well-being, and being very explicit about defining what well-being means for young people. So we're moving from, the phrase that the forum has used for multiple decades, we're moving from just a problem-free approach to what does it mean for young people to really be sort of fully prepared and fully participating. And then the other one, which got more to practice, was an opportunity that I had to work with the Office of Adolescent Health that had very much embraced positive youth development, but then wanted to get down to the practical level of, you're being asked to use evidence-based programs around pregnancy prevention. You're also being asked to use a positive youth development approach. How do these things fit together?
Right.
At that level, those are the conversations that often trip people up and help them sort of limit moving from this wonderful definition to how do I make sure I'm in compliance when the things that are coming in my door are still written very strictly.
Right.
Good. As I was getting ready for this and looking at the website, I saw that you all did a strategic plan, federal collaboration in 2016. I mean, first of all, I thought it was great that in addition to sort of setting up the capacity for collaboration, you were actually given funding to make a specific plan for how you're going to collaborate. Can you talk a little bit about that, and in particular sort of share the vision and a little bit about sort of what difference it's made to have this formal plan in place?
Yeah, absolutely. So we did receive a one-time appropriation from Congress to go out and do the strategic plan. There wasn't ever any funding attached with the executive order to have this working group and do the coordinating and collaborating work. And still to this day, even though we're running youth.gov as a website and we have, things that cost a fair amount of money each year to do, there's no appropriation line item or anything like that. For the working group, we actually are funded by the partner agencies. The partner agencies all contribute a certain amount of money each year, depending on sort of what content they want to have developed and what level of support they want from our contracting team, our great team at the American Institutes of Research, who have been working on this with us for the last 10 years. So it really, I think, speaks to the importance of the working group and of that collaboration and coordination, that federal agencies are actually coming to the table with money to contribute to this. But that wasn't enough to really get out and do a great strategic plan. So we did get that one-time appropriation from Congress. I believe it was in 2012 that happened. And then we were able to go out across the country and do a number of listening sessions with young people themselves, with parents, with educators, with folks who work in community-based organizations, with young people, getting all of the perspectives out there from stakeholders about what young people need to develop successfully, to have everything in place that they need for a successful transition to adulthood. And so the information from that listening session became this Pathways for Youth strategic plan that you see on the screen there. If you are on youth.gov, you can put Pathways for Youth into the search bar and you should come up with a PDF of the strategic plan itself and take a look at all of that. But we really focused on making sure that we took that positive youth development approach as we did this strategic plan, and we're viewing young people as resources and not as problems to be fixed or issues to be solved, but the capacity that they have to really make a contribution, and talking about how we promote these positive outcomes for all youth. Through that strategic plan, we kind of, reinforced what the original goals from the working group were from the executive order were for the working group around collaboration and coordination. And just to talk about that for a minute, I think the idea of silos, and especially silos coming from the federal government, is something that's been talked about for years across my whole career, across many years of thinking about how we could best be serving not just young people. Silos show up when we're serving any of the populations, but particularly for young people, right? Each of these federal agencies has their own mandate. They have their own legislation that created them or that controls them about what they can do, how they can do it, what they can fund, all those sort of rules around what can happen. But we all know that none of our lives, and particularly young people's lives, don't happen in silos. They are dealing with all kinds of different things at any one given time. And if you think about a young person who might be coming to a Department of Labor education and training program, looking to get into the workforce, get some job training, that young person is not just thinking about what education they need or what job training that they need. They're also thinking about where's their next meal coming from, and where might they be sleeping tonight if they have insecure housing, and what kind of behavioral health, substance abuse, or mental health issues are they struggling with that they need to get some services for in order to be able to stick through a program, a training program that the Department of Labor might be offering. And oftentimes the Department of Labor is just not equipped to meet all of those needs because that's not what they are funded by the government to do. And so having this interagency approach really is what allows us to streamline some of those things, to make sure that we're not duplicating things that are happening in different federal agencies and programs, and that so that we can leverage the resources that everybody brings to the table. And I saw a question in the chat about what we think some of our accomplishments of the Interagency Work Group have been over the past 10 years. And I think this is one that we can really point to, where this kind of collaboration that is our first goal has led to great outcomes. And there was a working group meeting a number of years ago, again, that predates me, but where the Department of Labor did come to the table and sort of share some issues that they were having with their Youth Build program, which brings young people in as a residential program and teaches skills and job training skills. And they were having a lot of trouble keeping young people in that program because of substance abuse issues. And it was a zero tolerance program. If you took a drug test and failed it, or were found to be using drugs and alcohol, you were out of the program. And given the trauma histories of young people coming in and just the sort of the life circumstances, there were a lot of young people struggling with those issues. And they said, we really don't know what to do about this. And staff person from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration was at the meeting and said, we have a program that we call SBIRT. It's the Screening, Brief Intervention, and Referral for Treatment Program, SBIRT. And that really could help if you could screen the young people as they came in and figure out who's having some issues at the top, when they're getting involved, and refer them for treatment. Send them to, most young people who were struggling with something could go to a relatively short treatment program and address some of those issues. Others needed, more full substance abuse treatment programming. But, using that tool would help identify problems in the beginning and get services involved so that they could then at the same time participate in the Youth Build program. And those two agencies got together and started integrating the SBIRT into the Youth Build programming. And lo and behold, the retention rates of Youth Build just skyrocketed. There were so many more young people who were able to make it through the program to its end. I think, it sometimes is a 12-month program or even longer. And so the number of young people who were able to be retained in that because they got those issues dealt with because of the collaboration of those two agencies is really something that we point to. And yes, the SBIRT tool is accessible. I see another question in the chat, and there's actually one of the slides in the carousel when you go to youth.gov is about the SBIRT, about a webinar that is training anyone who's interested in using that tool. So I really would encourage folks to go to that, and we are grateful to our partners at SAMHSA who have been making that available for a number of years. And that collaboration between SAMHSA and DOL was something that outside funders picked up on. The Hilton Foundation saw how well that was working, and they kind of continued the collaboration, did a pilot of it with some strong evaluation, and were able to document the really positive results of that collaboration. So that's the kind of thing that we are trying to foster when we have staff members from these various agencies at our table every month, hearing about what different programs offer, where there are opportunities to coordinate and to collaborate across the government. Secondly, we're working on evidence-based and innovative strategies and trying to disseminate information about that. Well, I think we'll have a little bit more of a conversation about that later on. And then that youth engagement and partnerships goal that really came from this process of these listening sessions that we had across the country. And this, you mentioned earlier, Karen, about sort of the process of getting all of these different agencies together. We did a lot of this work through 2012 and 2013, and then it took us 3 years to finalize this strategic plan because it had to go through the clearance process of 17 different federal agencies. So we were finally able to do that and finalize this plan in 2016 and start distributing it and getting it out there to the public. I think one of the things that's really important from this strategic plan is on the next slide, we share what the strengths-based vision for youth is. It's actually over 2 slides because it was too long to get on 1 slide, but this is the kind of the first 4 points of this strengths-based vision for youth. This is what we heard from communities across this country young people need. Youth and their families need safe, healthy, and stable places to live, learn, and work. And so there's a lot you can unpack just from that statement, right? Talking about what's safe, what's healthy, what's stable. And we're talking about where they're living, where they're learning, their school settings, their educational programs they're pursuing, their work environments. There's a lot in that. And talking about access to healthcare, education and training, life skills development, all those skills you need to transition to adulthood. And then the connections that young people need with their family, with their peers, with their schools, and with supportive adults and the community. And then the next slide, we talk a little bit about what organizations need, staffing needs for those organizations, training, the knowledge that providers of youth services need, and that youth need to be recognized by their communities for their strengths and have opportunities for engagement, service, and leadership. And at the end of the day, we want youth to be thriving throughout all phases of their development, all the way up into young adulthood and beyond. So that strengths-based vision for youth is really what has been driving us to think when we're talking about that really broad charge that we have to improve outcomes for youth. These are the kinds of outcomes that we are working on. And so this is new work that we've been doing over the last couple of years where, we took on the challenge. I mentioned how hard it was to clear the strategic plan through all of our partner agencies, which was 17 at the time. We're now 21. And so now across all 21 of those agencies, we have been working to determine what the common outcomes are that all of these agencies can find themselves somewhere in this chart and say, yes, we are contributing to improving outcomes in one of these 7 domains. So social emotional well-being, connectedness, health, healthy and safe environment, youth contribution and engagement, education, and employability and economic opportunity. We are still working through the process of how we take what all those various different agencies do and what they measure and rolling that up into kind of one indicator for how the agencies represented on the Interagency Working Group for Youth Programs are improving these outcomes. It's been a really big task that we've taken on. I've been grateful for the support of our contractors who understand more about the kind of mathematical ways to figure out how we show these outcomes. But this has been really grounded in the work that we did in the strategic plan and bringing all of those agencies together to say, what are you doing? What are you measuring? What are the most important things that your agency is trying to help young people achieve?
That was a great overview. I'm going to stay on this slide. I was on mute for a second, of course. I want to stay on this slide for a minute and just see if we can pull in some of the questions that have been popping up in the chat space. First of all, it's so important that youth contribution and engagement is listed as an outcome for all the reasons that you just said, as we're coming at this from a positive youth development perspective. One of the comments that came in, and I think this is from Roger at OSU, is that the current narrative around the epidemic portrays young people as a problem rather than as an asset.
Right.
Obviously, on youth.gov, you're really promoting young people as an asset. Are there things that you would suggest that we do? Are there things that could actually be done through the Interagency Work Group to really highlight the fact that young people are doing fantastic things across the country and how we sort of highlight their civic engagement in this effort?
Yeah. Yeah, that's actually a question that we have taken back to our editorial board, so that, and actually some virtual interns that we have as well. So current college students and this editorial board of young people from, I think they're mostly the 18 to 24 age range. But we've taken it back to them to say, what kind of content do you want to see, and how can we engage you all with the experts at in the federal government to translate some of that content, right? So we've taken a couple of pieces from the CDC. We had a conversation about this just last Friday, and our virtual interns are working on translating that into language that young people would be more responsive to. And the young people have been coming up with ideas for different things that they could do. They've asked about, I'm not promising any of this stuff is coming. This is all still in the decision-making phase. But the young people have had ideas about, could we host a conversation, a dialogue between somebody on our editorial board and an expert on public health issues or on mental health and substance abuse issues. And could we have that conversation in like a Instagram live sort of setting where young people could tune in and listen to another young person asking questions and helping to translate the information. We've been talking about resources that we could offer. I think there's been a lot of this where, there have been different news programs or different individuals who've really been trying to highlight the positive that's happening. And a lot of the stories that I see about people who are responding to the crisis in different ways have been about young people, have been about children who have thought about different ways that they can deliver food or resources to elderly people that are isolated in their community. And so I think continuing to highlight those kind of really incredible responses would be great to continue to be able to highlight that. We would love to. We have a portion on Youth Engaged for Change that's called Changemakers, which highlights inspiring stories of youth. And it's something that, as we were kind of user testing that website across a broad group of young people, that was what really was speaking to them the most, reading about other individuals their age with similar characteristics to them, similar backgrounds, and what big challenges they had been able to face and overcome and how they had done that. And so I imagine that we will use that Changemaker tool that we have to highlight some young people that have really stepped up during this crisis. And so that website, you can find it from youth.gov, or if you go to engage.youth.gov, so engage.youth.gov, you will find the Youth Engage for Change website, which is the portion that is very directed at young people themselves rather than the adults who work with youth for youth.gov.
Perfect. I think if you all are putting examples and collecting examples in that space and encouraging young people to think about that, that's a wonderful resource. And that question has come up frequently on other conversations I've been on over the past 2 weeks. How do we really demonstrate that? And even how do we get more creative about it, to the extent that we are in an increasingly virtual environment. That's a place where young people are often much more experienced than we are in coming up with solutions about how to create community in virtual spaces. A couple of other quick questions which we can take care of. And again, I want to acknowledge for people who aren't in the chat, apparently the links on youth.gov aren't working at the moment, and come back later. Hopefully
yes.
it'll be fixed. But folks,
I have sent a text message to try to address that.
So we don't need more comments on that. We see that that's happening. The recording and the slides will be available afterwards. There's a specific question about SBIRT and whether it's only available to government organizations or to non-government. Do you know that, or is that information going to be found on the website?
Yeah, it's broadly available as far as I know. So that webinar that I mentioned is available to any community-based organization about how to use the SBIRT. And I think like community-based organization may even be too narrow. I think anybody can sign up for that webinar and learn how to use that tool. And there's information about that tool, which I will write again in the chat group right there about SBIRT. If you go to the SAMHSA website, you can find, if you Google SAMHSA and SBIRT, you will come up with the information about that tool as well.
Wonderful, that's great. That sounds exciting. Before we shift over into sort of research and evaluation and evidence, there are a lot of questions there, and I think we can sort of spend our last 15 minutes in that space. there was a question about sort of the faith-based community and how they're engaged. I know that in various administrations over the decades, there have been real efforts to engage the faith-based community. Is that something that the Interagency Working Group is focused on, has information on?
Yeah, so at different times, I mean, we have a office in HHS that's a faith-based partnership and community engagement office that we have worked with, and they have brought various presentations to the working group. I am recalling one recent one that we did with a group called Open Table, which really works on connecting young people. I think it's probably, the program is for adults as well, but they were speaking about connecting young adults in their communities, whether they're folks that are returning from a juvenile detention stay, or young people that have had experience in the foster care system. When they come into the community, the church really, through this Open Table approach, has been bringing all the different individuals in the community who have something that young adult needs in their life, and sitting around one table and figuring out how all of those services can be provided to the young person. And so we definitely have presentations from different faith-based groups over the years that can bring in different information, and the only rule really is that they are available and providing services to young people who might be being served by government programs. And I did see a question in the chat about how folks can get their resources onto youth.gov, and just want to reiterate that this really is a one-stop shop for federal resources. So we are primarily highlighting resources that are coming from federal sources that have been produced by one of our partner agencies. We also tap into pretty heavily some of the large youth organizations, Forum for Youth Investment, and pretty much anything Karen and her team puts out, we will put up on youth.gov and refer to it, or organizations like America's Promise Alliance, or some of the large, really well-known and vetted youth organizations. We will share resources from them at times when we don't have federal resources to kind of fill a particular gap or a need that we've noticed. So that's really where the vast majority of the resources come from that are on youth.gov.
Great. Well, there are more questions coming in that I know what to do with, so we will I will let you scan those and see if there are other specific ones that you want answered. I think some of them you've just reminded people that this is a federal interagency work group,
right?
And so folks can't join unless they happen to be a federal agency,
right.
and that these common outcomes that are up on the screen certainly are sort of outcome domains that are sort of pretty generally recognized as things that all come together to add up to what we would talk about as sort of youth thriving.
Right.
A thriving young person really is doing well in most of these domains, and usually not having serious problems in any, with unevenness in the domains. And there are various ways that you can measure them, but as you said, you all are in the early stages of thinking about what it is you're going to do from a measurement perspective to move towards.
Yeah, and from the measurement perspective, we really focused on not adding to the burden of any of the agencies who are our partners. It is a Herculean task to get a federal agency to change the way that they measure something or tools that they use. And so we really have focused on having folks bring to the table what they are already measuring, what they are looking at in their either federal grantee reporting or any evaluations that they're doing. And so we have placed the burden on our contracting team really, and our staff from ASPE to think through how we can take all of the different ways the things are being measured, the specific outcomes are being measured in these domains, and then roll that up into one way of reporting out what's happening. And so, there may be some measure out there that gets at all of these things. I haven't found one that's perfect yet. But what we did as we were coming up with as part of our 2 years worth of work has been comparing what we were hearing from the federal agencies that got us to these 7 domains against a lot of existing frameworks, one of which is one that you all put out from the Forum for Youth Investment, for Youth Investment that put out a number of years ago. And the Youth Thrive that you just mentioned, something that CSSP has, the Center for Study of Social Policy has. I'm having to spell out all of these acronyms that we live in the federal government, and sometimes I forget what they stand for. But we really looked at a number of different taxonomies and ways of thinking about what all young people need, and made sure that ours was fitting with that. You know, we didn't, as Karen just said, these are all areas that are essentially recognized across any number of reputable groups that have taken on very rigorous approaches to coming up with a set of domains like this. We didn't find one that fit exactly all of our federal programs, and so we did end up creating this to make sure that all of our programs could see themselves somewhere in this setup that we have with the domains. And we're taking what they're already measuring and rolling that up into how we'll be reporting on these outcomes.
I think that that approach is one that the forum has used over the years in working with children's cabinets at the state and the local level. I think to great benefit. As you said, it's a Herculean task to think that you're going to come up with common measures,
Right.
but it's often a very useful task to just compare across these silos what measures people are using, put them up into a common framework, and then just look at that data collectively and ask questions. In the same way that you gave that very specific example of how the Department of Labor came to the table with a problem that was able to be handled from the substance abuse side.
Right.
What we have found is that when you sort of create this bigger picture of how well young people are doing in multiple areas, and give agencies a chance to look at trends and look at subpopulations, ideas pop up, connections pop up that wouldn't be there otherwise. And that's a fundamental part of when we talk about taking a youth development approach. It is this kind of holistic approach that says just because your responsibility is only for one of these boxes doesn't mean that the young people that you're working with don't come with all of these boxes. And so that's really important. One of the questions that was asked earlier, I think by Sharon Adams-Taylor, was, we talk a lot about evidence-based programs, but we're talking about a positive youth development approach. Do we actually have evidence that a positive youth development approach helps? What's the evidence around why we need to use this bigger approach? And then I would just sort of add into that, as we're acknowledging this approach, we also have the challenge that evidence-based programs often have fidelity and fit issues when organizations and communities start to implement them. So if we start with this very narrow thing of here's an evidence-based program that was designed to address a particular issue with a particular strategy, and we're trying to put it in the context of this interagency work, of a holistic definition of young people, and of the fact that by the time these things get to communities, they often don't fit, or there often isn't funding. How do you reconcile those two things with the work group?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Really nice setup, Karen. Thank you for some work that we've been doing around and actually doing in partnership with the forum around thinking about the core components of successful programs for young people. I'm not sure that those two things should be reconciled. I think maybe we need to add to the way we think about evidence-based programming. And for the reasons that you just were saying, I think we learned about some really great examples in the juvenile justice field, where there have been some studies done looking at all of the evidence-based programs that were out there. Juvenile justice has a couple of different lists that they put on a website, right? The way that we traditionally have been kind of funding and doing evidence-based program from the federal level has been looking at specific programs and doing a randomized controlled trial study of that to find effectiveness on one of the outcomes that was targeted. And if there was evidence, statistical evidence of effectiveness on that, saying that this program has evidence that it addresses whichever issue that happened to be, if it's teen pregnancy prevention or home visiting effectiveness, lots of different areas where these kinds of evidence-based programs were studied. And those programs got on a registry, and then those were the programs that the feds would fund grantees to implement in their communities and in their settings. And a researcher out of Vanderbilt University named Mark Lipsey took a look across all of the juvenile justice programs that were happening out in the community And knowing that there were these registries that had millions and millions of dollars poured into them to develop, and found that only 7% of the programs that were functioning in the community were being drawn from those registries. There were lots of barriers to using those programs. Those programs are, branded model programs that come with a cost for people to kind of buy that program and learn how to implement it. That cost was a barrier. Implementing those programs with fidelity to exactly the way that they were studied, which might have been studied with a population, not exactly the population that folks in the community were trying to serve. It wasn't the same age group, it was a different demographic makeup, a different community, but maybe a rural community wanted to use an evidence-based program that had been, the studies had been done in an urban environment. So there were a whole lot of reasons why just grabbing a program off of a registry and implementing it in the community doesn't really work. And so we've been thinking about how we broaden this and think about across all of these programs that we know have some evidence on particular outcomes, how do we focus on what the core components of those programs are and show that those are the pieces of a program that matter when you implement them correctly, that's how you are going to have the best chance of improving that particular outcome. And then you can implement those practices and those strategies and wrap the rest of your program around that, because we believe that the individuals that are out there on the ground serving young people have the best understanding of what the young people in their community need. And we want them to look to the research and to look to what has been shown to have effectiveness through rigorous research standards of what to implement. But we think you should have flexibility to do that in the way that makes the most sense for your community. So we've been partnering with the forum, and there's a great paper on the forum's website on what it means to take a core components approach. We have funded some other research that is still kind of in progress and coming soon, that's looking at some specific outcomes. If you are a program that's really working with a lot of young people who are struggling with externalizing behavior, or the kind of acting out, the things that might get young people in trouble at school or suspended from school or fighting or aggressive behaviors, those sort of things, we will be coming out with some research around what the core components are of programs that have effectiveness for that outcome, also for social skills and interpersonal skills, and for self-regulation. And I know I'm teasing that because it's going to take probably another year before all of those are out and available and ready, but that's the kind of way that we're starting to think about this. And we were certainly not the first people to think of it. When we brought this to the forum, they said, yep, lots of people are talking about that. Let's work together about how we kind of broaden this conversation. So that's been a really exciting endeavor to be partnered with you all in, Karen. And I know that you guys have a lot of work on that front.
Yes, absolutely. We'll make sure that we put a link to that paper into the chat box as we're moving toward the end, or send it and send it out as we send the archive out for this session as well, to everybody who participated or who signed up. Again, more questions than we can answer, so we will come off of this, and if there are other questions, Cheri, that we didn't have time to answer that you'd like to, we'll send those answers out as well when we send out the archive and the updates. One final question, and this is a question that I ask because I know in our work at the state and local level with these kinds of coordinating agency groups, the education system at every level seems to be, I don't have a polite way to say it, the weak link at the table. Are you experiencing that? Do you have any thoughts about that? And especially, I just did a blog sort of titled, what happens when out of school time is all the time? So many of the agencies that are around the table are agencies that work with young people, either in those out of school hours or in crisis times, et cetera. But our schools are the organizations that are supposed to have them full time. Yet it seems to be hard to get them to come to the table to really think about coordination. What are your thoughts on that in your last couple of minutes? Yeah,
we have success spots that we can point to. I think these sort of relationships can always be improved. I think for a long time, the Department of Education has been the agency that is assumed to be responsible for youth development, right? Because kids are in school most of their hours, because that's where a lot of all of these different programs so many of the social emotional learning programs are now being incorporated into schools. And really it's something that COVID-19 has kind of shown for us all, right? How much schools have been depended upon to do, and how we're really having to think about how do we feed kids now because they're not in school, because schools have been doing that. And how do we, child maltreatment reports are dropping because so often it's been teachers and school nurses and school personnel who have been making the calls to the hotlines to report abuse. And so it's really making us realize how much schools have been considered responsible for, and that we really should be thinking about other ways to deliver a lot of those services. So we've had some great partnerships over the years with the Office of Safe and Healthy Students at the Department of Education. There was an Office of Student, or there is an Office of Student Engagement. There was a person who was considered the coordinator for student engagement, who that person isn't there anymore. So, we struggle with that some as people come and go from federal agencies, but I think we can always improve those kinds of partnerships and those kinds of relationships. And that really is what it's based on. It's a staff level group. We tend to be staffed by those people who remain in government for a while. They don't change as the administrations change, so that we can kind of keep this work going. But I really think what it speaks to is that we need these partnerships more than ever to be able to deliver all these kinds of services, because we have experts in the federal government on providing all of these different needs, to making sure that all those different needs are met for kids. And if we can improve the coordination and the partnerships with the Department of Education and other agencies, we really can take some of the burden off of one agency to try to do all of those different things.
I think that's a really important way to think about this. I agree with you 100% that the incredible amount of things that happen in this thing that we call school get underestimated when, from an outcomes perspective, we think, well, they're just responsible for academic development. And this crisis that we're in demonstrates the range of both people who are in the building, services that are in the building,
Right.
connections that are made. So hopefully we can flip that. I think Allison raised a question, and maybe this is the one to end on, which is, what would be the most impactful next steps to advance positive development efforts for federal staff and others in the field to take advantage of? I mean, people want to know how to work with you more.
Yeah.
One way is to do that through federal staff. What are some of the most powerful things that we could do next, and how can we on the call be helpful?
Yeah, so this is a little bit of a soapbox for me, right? Federal agencies at this point, we can really only do what we've been mandated to do. And so we're doing the best that we can to get this information out about positive youth development and thinking about the overall development of every young person in our country, thinking about their success. This country really doesn't have a plan for positive youth development. We don't have a positive youth development policy. We have policies in this country for when things have gone wrong. So we have a juvenile justice policy for when someone's gotten in trouble, or we have a child welfare policy when there's been a breakdown in the family. And so that's really the way that our policy system is built. And what about shifting that to think about a national policy for what every young person needs to survive? These common outcomes that are listed here on the screen could really be the foundation for starting to think that way. But that kind of change and that kind of cultural shift really has to come from outside. It has to come from generating ideas from community-based organizations and groups like you all represent here on this call, and putting pressure on our legislators to think about that and to think about creating a policy that would ensure all of our young people can thrive.
Well, Cheri, I think you've handed it back to me for the final kickoff, and that's exactly the work that the forum is trying to do at the national, state, and local levels in raising the idea of these thriving youth fields. Can we think about a thriving youth policy that adds these things together, or a set of policies that we at least look at through a single lens? So I think you're 100% right that this is a place for us to partner with you. I want to thank you for taking the time to join us. Hand it back to Ian for our last minute to give him any last minute instructions that he wants to give our listeners. And thank you again for what was a wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Can't thank both Cheri and Karen enough for such a wonderful and thoughtful conversation that I think is really needed at this time. So, thank you both, and also thank you for everyone who was able to join us today and for all your excellent questions that still seem to be coming in droves. So we will summarize those and attempt to answer as many as possible in the follow-up to today's session. As we've mentioned a few times, today's session is being recorded, and we'll share both the slides and the recording in the coming days. Wanted to let you know that we have a webinar coming up on May 1st. It'll be on summer learning, and it will feature Deborah Maroney and Chris Smith. So I will send out information about that, as well as a sign-up link with the follow-up for today's session. We invite you to please stay in touch as much as possible. We are uniquely positioned to connect to a broad range of stakeholders who care about youth. So we would love to help connect you to appropriate resources. So please feel free to get in touch with us if you have specific questions or struggling with particular issues. Our email address is info@forumfyi.org. So we strongly encourage you to reach out and let us know what information that you're seeking. And also visit our website. I shared a few links both to Karen's blog as well as to the core components paper that was mentioned. But we definitely invite you to continually explore the website and everything that is available on there. So again, thank you very much to everyone, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.